I thought losing my father would be the hardest thing I would ever endure. I was wrong. The words came to me as I sat across from my father's attorney just 3 days after the funeral, staring at a folder that seemed far too thin to contain the story of a man who had spent 86 years building a life, a family, and a legacy. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I was 68 years old when I learned that grief can hide another kind of pain beneath it, one that arrives quietly and waits until you are too exhausted to defend yourself. The attorney's office smelled faintly of coffee and old books. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the polished conference table. I folded my hands in my lap and tried to focus on the practical matters my father would have wanted handled properly. My father, George Whitmore, had been gone for less than a week. Even saying those words in my mind felt unreal. For months before his passing, my older sister Linda had taken charge of nearly everything. She organized appointments, answered phone calls, handled paperwork, and spoke confidently whenever decisions needed to be made. Everyone praised her devotion. Family friends called her the perfect daughter. Even I believed it. The attorney adjusted his glasses and opened the file. "Before we proceed," he said, "I want to confirm that you received your distribution documents and payment confirmation." I blinked. "My what?" He looked surprised. "Your inheritance documents. They were finalized months ago." For a moment I wondered if I had misunderstood him. Grief can make simple conversations feel confusing. "There must be a mistake," I said. "Nothing has been finalized with me." The attorney frowned and shuffled through several papers. "According to our records, all correspondence was delivered electronically. We received confirmations and approvals." A strange chill moved through me. "Approvals from whom?" I asked. He turned a page and pointed toward a printed email chain. "From your email address." My heart began to beat a little faster. I leaned forward. The email on the page looked familiar. It was mine, or at least it appeared to be. The address was correct. The signature looked correct. Yet I had never seen the messages before. I had never approved anything. I had never even been informed that paperwork was being processed. "That can't be right," I whispered. The attorney remained professional, but I could see uncertainty crossing his face. "Mrs. Whitmore, are you saying these communications were not sent by you?" I looked down at the documents again. My father had always promised that his estate would be divided fairly between Linda and me. He repeated it often enough that it became family lore. Fairness mattered to him. Transparency mattered to him. Yet somehow decisions had been made without my knowledge. I swallowed hard. "I'm saying I've never seen any of this." The room grew very quiet. Outside the office window, traffic moved along the street as if nothing unusual had happened. People walked their dogs. A delivery truck rolled through the intersection. The ordinary world continued while mine shifted beneath my feet. The attorney carefully closed the folder. "Then I think we need to slow down and review everything." I nodded, but my thoughts were already elsewhere. I pictured Linda standing beside my father's hospital bed. I remembered how often she insisted on handling conversations for him. I remembered calls that were never returned, updates that never reached me, explanations that somehow always sounded reasonable. For the first time, those memories felt different. Not comforting, not reassuring, suspicious. As I left the office that afternoon, carrying copies of documents I didn't understand, one question echoed louder than all the others. If I never approved the inheritance paperwork, who had been speaking in my name all this time? The drive home felt longer than usual, even though the attorney's office was less than 15 miles from my house. Every traffic light seemed to hold me in place, giving my thoughts more time to wander into places I did not want to visit. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the late afternoon sun stretched across the lawn my father had helped me landscape years ago. I sat in the car for several minutes without moving. The folder rested on the passenger seat beside me, looking harmless despite the questions it contained. Inside my house, the silence felt heavier than normal. I set the folder on the kitchen table and automatically reached for the coffee pot, only to remember I had not made any that morning. Small routines had become harder since my father's health had declined. For the past 2 years, much of my life had revolved around helping him whenever I could. Linda had always insisted she handled the major decisions, but I visited whenever she allowed it, brought groceries, paid bills when needed, and spent long afternoons listening to him tell stories he had already told dozens of times. I treasured every one of them. As evenings settled outside the windows, I opened my banking application and reviewed my finances. There was nothing unusual there. No large deposits. No inheritance funds. No mysterious transfers. Just the same modest balances I had been managing for years. I lived carefully. I watched every utility bill. I compared grocery prices. I postponed replacing an aging refrigerator because the old one still worked if I ignored the strange noise it made every few hours. If money from my father's estate had truly been distributed months ago, none of it had reached me. That realization sat in my chest like a stone. The more I thought about it, the more another uncomfortable truth surfaced. Linda had gradually become the gatekeeper of information long before our father passed away. At first it seemed natural. She lived closer. She retired earlier than I did. She had more time available. Whenever relatives called, they spoke to her first. Whenever doctors needed signatures or updates, they contacted her. Whenever family decisions were discussed, Linda somehow already knew the details before anyone else. I remembered asking for copies of medical reports and being told not to worry. I remembered requesting updates after appointments and receiving vague summaries instead of specifics. At the time, I assumed she was simply overwhelmed. Now I was no longer certain. Around 7 o'clock, my phone rang. Linda's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it for a moment before answering. Her voice sounded warm and familiar. She asked whether I was eating properly, whether I was sleeping, whether I needed anything. To anyone listening, she would have sounded like the most caring sister in America. I answered politely and revealed nothing about my meeting with the attorney. Something inside me urged caution. Near the end of the conversation, she casually mentioned that the estate matters had mostly been settled and that I should not burden myself with paperwork during such an emotional time. The comment seemed ordinary on the surface, but it landed differently now. After we hung up, I sat quietly in the darkened kitchen. The folder remained unopened in front of me. Outside, a neighbor's porch light flickered on. Inside, a single question continued growing louder. If Linda truly believed everything had been handled properly, why was she so eager to keep me away from the details? The next morning I woke before sunrise and found myself standing in the kitchen staring at the folder again. I had barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw copies of emails I had never written and approvals I had never given. By 6 o'clock, I was sitting at the table with a yellow legal pad, making notes the way my father used to whenever he faced a problem that required patience instead of emotion. Facts first, assumptions later. I wrote down every detail I could remember from the attorney's office. Then I listed every occasion during the past 2 years when Linda had handled something on my behalf. The list became longer than I expected. Doctor appointments, insurance questions, financial discussions, conversations with accountants, requests for signatures, updates that never seemed to arrive directly from the source. By mid-morning, I decided to call my niece Emily Carter. Emily was 32, worked in information technology, and possessed the kind of practical intelligence that always impressed me. She had adored her grandfather and had spent many weekends helping him with computers, phones, and online accounts. When I explained that I needed help reviewing some digital records, she immediately offered to stop by after work. That afternoon moved slowly. I sorted old mail, watered the plants on my back patio, and tried not to let my imagination run ahead of the evidence. More than once I caught myself searching for innocent explanations. Perhaps the attorney's office had mixed up records. Perhaps someone had entered an incorrect address. Perhaps grief was making me suspicious. Yet each explanation collapsed under a simple fact. The emails existed. They carried my name. Someone had communicated with professionals while pretending to be me. Emily arrived shortly after 5 carrying a laptop bag and 2 cups of coffee. She listened carefully as I described everything. Unlike many people, she did not interrupt or jump to conclusions. She simply asked questions. Precise questions. Thoughtful questions. Questions that forced me to separate what I knew from what I merely suspected. After nearly an hour, she asked whether I still had access to the email account listed on the documents. I did, although I rarely used it anymore. Years earlier, I had switched to a newer address because the older account constantly filled with advertisements and unwanted messages. Emily helped me sign in. Thousands of unread emails appeared on the screen. Most were ordinary promotions and newsletters. We began searching through folders one by one. Nothing seemed unusual at first. Then Emily paused. A small crease appeared between her eyebrows. She clicked the settings menu and remained silent for several seconds. Aunt Margaret, she said carefully, did you ever create forwarding rules for this account? I shook my head. I would not even know how. Emily turned the screen toward me. Several automated forwarding instructions were listed there. Every incoming message from specific financial institutions, legal offices, and estate management services had been redirected elsewhere before I ever saw them. My stomach tightened. Redirected where? I asked. Emily clicked another screen. An address appeared. I stared at it without speaking. The name attached to the account belonged to Linda. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. The kitchen seemed unusually quiet. Even the refrigerator's familiar hum faded into the background. Emily finally looked at me and spoke softly. I think we just found the reason you never received those emails. I looked back at the screen, feeling the first cold edge of a truth I was not yet ready to fully understand. After Emily left that evening, I remained at the kitchen table long after midnight. The laptop screen had gone dark, but the image of Linda's email address remained vivid in my mind. I kept replaying every possible explanation, searching for one that would preserve the sister I thought I knew. Perhaps she had set up the forwarding years ago to help our father manage correspondence. Perhaps she forgot it existed. Perhaps there was some misunderstanding hidden inside a technical detail it did not yet understand. But the longer I sat with those possibilities, the less convincing they became. The forwarding rules were not random. They were specific. Financial institutions, attorneys, estate planners. Every category connected to my father's affairs had been quietly redirected away from me. The next morning, Emily called before breakfast. She had been thinking about the situation and wanted to review the account more carefully. By noon, she was back at my house, her laptop open on the dining room table. Together, we began examining messages that had never reached my inbox. At first, the emails seemed ordinary. Appointment confirmations, requests for information, legal updates. Then we discovered entire conversations that stretched back nearly 18 months. Messages from attorneys asking questions, replies sent from my account, documents approved in my name, instructions acknowledged with what appeared to be my consent. I read each message slowly, feeling a strange distance from the words. The tone was polite, professional, convincing. Whoever wrote them understood enough about me to sound believable. Yet they were not my words. I would never have written them. Emily printed several pages and organized them into neat stacks. The more evidence we reviewed, the more a pattern emerged. Someone had not merely monitored information. Someone had actively participated in conversations while creating the appearance that I was involved. What troubled me most was how carefully everything had been done. There were no dramatic mistakes, no obvious signs of panic. The messages were calm and deliberate, as though the person sending them never expected to be questioned. Late that afternoon, I found myself thinking about a conversation with my father nearly 2 years earlier. We had been sitting on his back porch watching a summer storm roll across the horizon. He told me that fairness mattered more than money. He said families survived difficult times when people trusted one another. At the time, I smiled and agreed. Now the memory carried a different weight. I wondered what he would think if he knew what I was discovering. Emily eventually pointed toward a series of emails exchanged only 6 months earlier. You should read these, she said quietly. The messages involved discussions about asset valuations and preliminary distribution plans. One sentence immediately caught my attention. An attorney asked whether both daughters had reviewed the proposed arrangements. The response, sent from my account, stated that I had no concerns and trusted Linda to manage the process on behalf of the family. I stared at those words for a long time, not because they sounded inaccurate. In truth, they reflected exactly how I once felt. That was what made them so unsettling. Whoever wrote the message understood the relationship Linda and I had shared. They knew which words would seem authentic. As the afternoon sunlight faded across the room, a realization settled over me. This was no accidental oversight. Too many decisions had been made. Too many conversations had occurred. Too many opportunities existed where the truth could have been clarified. For the first time since the funeral, I stopped asking whether something was wrong and began asking how far it actually went. And deep down, I feared the answer might be much larger than an inheritance. For the next several days, Emily and I continued working quietly. Neither of us contacted Linda. Neither of us mentioned what we had found to anyone else in the family. I wanted facts before accusations. My father had always believed that assumptions caused more damage than the truth ever could, and I intended to follow that principle no matter how uncomfortable the process became. Each morning I sat at my dining room table with coffee and a growing stack of printed emails. Each afternoon, Emily stopped by after work to help organize timelines, dates, and records. The deeper we looked, the more disturbing the picture became. What had first appeared to be a handful of redirected messages was actually an entire system. Important correspondence had been filtered away from me for months. Legal notices, financial summaries, requests for confirmation, follow-up questions. All of it quietly routed elsewhere before I ever had a chance to read it. One evening, Emily discovered a folder containing messages exchanged between Linda and several professional advisors involved in my father's estate. Most of the conversations were careful and polite. Nothing openly improper appeared on the surface. Yet a pattern emerged. Whenever someone suggested contacting me directly, Linda often responded first. She explained that I was overwhelmed. She explained that I preferred not to deal with details. She explained that she was helping coordinate communication for the family. Reading those messages felt strangely painful because they contained fragments of truth. There had been difficult months when I was exhausted caring for my father. There had been days when I appreciated Linda's willingness to handle certain tasks. That was what made everything so confusing. Trust had not disappeared all at once. It had been slowly repurposed. One document in particular caught my attention. It was a planning memorandum discussing future arrangements for family assets that had not yet been distributed. Near the end of the document, several options were listed regarding long-term management responsibilities. Beside one recommendation was a note that made my stomach tighten. The note suggested that I might eventually require assistance managing my affairs and that a trusted family member should be prepared to assume greater oversight if necessary. At first, I thought little of it. Age-related planning is common. Then Emily opened a related email chain. As we read through the messages, the room grew quiet. Linda had repeatedly described me as increasingly forgetful, easily confused, and unable to manage complex decisions. The descriptions were subtle, never dramatic, never extreme, but they created a consistent narrative. A narrative that did not resemble reality. I lived independently. I managed my own finances. I drove myself everywhere. I volunteered twice a week at the local library. Yet according to these conversations, I was gradually becoming incapable of handling important responsibilities. Emily looked up from the screen. Aunt Margaret, this goes beyond the inheritance. I already knew she was right. The inheritance had been the door that opened everything else. The larger concern was what seemed to be developing behind it. Someone had spent months shaping how other people viewed me. Not openly, not aggressively, quietly, methodically, through emails, conversations, and recommendations that sounded reasonable when viewed individually. I sat back in my chair and stared through the kitchen window into the darkening evening. For the first time, I stopped wondering whether Linda had crossed a line. The evidence had already answered that question. What I needed to understand now was how far ahead she had planned and what she believed would happen next if nobody ever discovered the truth. The following week brought a clarity I had not expected. Once a person stops questioning whether something happened and starts examining how it happened, the world begins to look different. Small memories rise to the surface. Conversations that once seemed ordinary suddenly carry new meaning. As I reviewed more documents with Emily, moments from the past 2 years returned one after another. I remembered family gatherings where Linda answered questions directed at me before I could speak. I remembered occasions when relatives mentioned updates they assumed I already knew. At the time, I laughed and blamed my busy schedule. Now I wondered where those updates had actually come from. One afternoon, Emily arrived with a binder she had assembled from printed emails, timelines, and public records. She spread everything across my dining room table with the careful precision of someone building a puzzle. For nearly 3 hours, we compared dates. Patterns emerged everywhere. The same names appeared repeatedly. The same discussions resurfaced. The same narrative followed me through countless conversations. According to those records, I was overwhelmed. According to those records, I preferred to avoid complicated matters. According to those records, I trusted Linda to make decisions on my behalf. What struck me most was that none of those statements were completely false. That was what made them effective. A lie wrapped around pieces of truth is often harder to detect than an obvious deception. Late that afternoon, Emily uncovered another email exchange. This one involved an advisor who had expressed concern about excluding me from a planning discussion. The response came quickly. Linda assured him that I had been informed and fully supported the arrangement. She even described a conversation that supposedly took place between us. I stared at the message for several seconds. The conversation never happened, yet the details sounded believable enough that nobody reading the email would question them. The realization left me with an uncomfortable feeling. This was not impulsive behavior. It required preparation. It required consistency. It required someone willing to maintain the same story across months of correspondence. That evening, I found myself standing in front of a framed photograph of my father displayed on a bookshelf in the living room. The picture had been taken nearly 10 years earlier during a family picnic. He stood between Linda and me with one arm around each daughter. Looking at that image brought both comfort and sadness. My father spent his entire life believing that family trust was one of the most valuable things a person could possess. He believed loyalty could survive disagreements, distance, and difficult circumstances. I wondered what he would think if he could see the evidence now sitting inside a binder on my dining room table. The next morning, I received a call from the attorney. He had quietly begun reviewing the concerns I raised during our first meeting. His tone remained professional, but I sensed a change in his attitude. He asked whether I had uncovered anything relevant. I told him only part of the truth, enough to keep the process moving, not enough to reveal the full extent of what Emily and I had discovered. When the call ended, I sat quietly for several minutes. A growing certainty settled over me. The inheritance itself was no longer the central issue. Money could be calculated. Property could be evaluated. Documents could be corrected. Trust was different. Trust was harder to restore once broken. And as I looked at the growing collection of evidence spread across my home, I began to suspect that the most important revelation was still waiting somewhere ahead of us, hidden inside records we had not yet examined. 2 days later, Emily called me during breakfast and asked if she could come over immediately. There was something unusual in her voice, not panic, but urgency. Within an hour, she was sitting across from me at the kitchen table with her laptop open and several printed pages stacked beside it. I could tell she had found something important. She took a breath and turned the screen toward me. "I think we found what they were building toward," she said quietly. The documents in front of us were not directly related to my father's estate. Instead, they concerned future planning discussions that had taken place over the previous year. At first glance, they appeared harmless. Advisors discussing options. Professionals exchanging recommendations. Family support plans. Yet the deeper we read, the clearer the pattern became. My name appeared repeatedly. So did descriptions of my supposed limitations. Several emails suggested that I struggled with financial decisions. Others implied that I relied heavily on Linda for guidance. One message even described me as vulnerable to confusion during stressful situations. I felt my stomach tighten. None of it was true. What unsettled me most was how carefully the narrative had been constructed. No single email crossed an obvious line. No message contained outrageous claims. Instead, each one added a small brushstroke to a portrait of a woman who needed increasing supervision. Emily opened another file. This one contained correspondence between Linda and a consulting professional who specialized in senior care planning. I stared at the screen. Senior care planning. The phrase alone made me uneasy. There is nothing wrong with preparing for the future, but nobody had ever discussed such plans with me. According to the emails, however, conversations had been taking place for months. Several facilities had been researched. Different levels of support had been compared. Cost estimates had been requested. One message stood out from all the others. Linda wrote that moving me into a structured living environment would eventually simplify management of family assets and reduce unnecessary complications. I read the sentence twice, then a third time. The words were polite, professional, reasonable on the surface, yet beneath them sat an assumption I could not ignore. Decisions about my future were being discussed without my knowledge. I walked to the window and looked out across my backyard. The maple tree near the fence line was beginning to lose a few leaves. A gentle breeze moved through the branches. Everything outside appeared calm and ordinary. Inside, however, another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. The inheritance was never the final destination. It was only part of a larger plan. If the emails were accurate, Linda had spent months positioning herself as the trusted decision-maker in every important area of my life. Financial matters. legal matters, future living arrangements. The realization brought an unexpected sense of clarity. For weeks I had been struggling to understand motive. Why risk so much? Why maintain such an elaborate deception? Now I finally saw the broader picture. Control. Not just over money. Over information. Over decisions. Over how others perceive me. Emily broke the silence. "What do you want to do?" she asked. I looked back at the growing stack of evidence covering my dining room table. A month earlier, I would have confronted Linda immediately. I would have demanded explanations. I would have searched for reconciliation before understanding the facts. Now I felt differently. The truth was still unfolding, and every time we uncovered a new record, it revealed something larger than the discovery before it. I returned to my chair and carefully organized the documents into a folder. For the first time since this began, I felt certain about one thing. Linda believed her story was complete. She believed everyone already saw me through the lens she had created. What she did not know was that the evidence was finally beginning to tell a very different story. Over the next 2 weeks, I did something that surprised even me. I waited. Not because I was afraid, and not because I doubted what we had discovered, but because every new piece of evidence seemed to reveal another layer beneath it. The attorney continued his review. Emily continued organizing records. And I continued acting exactly as I always had. I answered Linda's phone calls. I met her for lunch one afternoon at a small cafe near the town square. I listened as she spoke about family matters, upcoming holidays, and the importance of staying united after our father's passing. Anyone watching us would have seen two sisters navigating grief together. Linda smiled easily. She asked whether I was taking care of myself. She reminded me to rest. More than once she referred to how stressful financial matters could be at our age. I simply nodded and listened. The strangest part was realizing how much confidence she seemed to have. She never appeared nervous. She never acted as though there was anything to hide. The certainty in her behavior told me something important. She believed her version of events had already been accepted by everyone who mattered. Meanwhile, the attorney requested additional documentation from several advisors who had participated in the estate process. The responses arrived gradually. Some clarified timelines. Others confirmed communications. Each new document strengthened the pattern we had already uncovered. More importantly, they established something difficult to dismiss. Decisions had repeatedly been influenced by information that did not originate from me. One afternoon, Emily called with another development. A family meeting had been scheduled by the attorney's office for the following week. Officially, the purpose was to review final estate matters and address outstanding questions. Unofficially, I suspected something else was happening. The attorney had seen enough evidence to recognize that serious concerns existed. That evening I sat alone on my back porch watching the sun disappear behind the trees. The air carried the first hints of autumn. I thought about my father. I thought about trust. I thought about how easily people assume that deception announces itself through dramatic actions when, in reality, it often arrives quietly through small decisions repeated over time. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Linda. She wanted to confirm that I would attend the meeting. Her message ended with a reassuring sentence. "Do not worry. Everything has already been taken care of." I stared at those words for a long moment. They perfectly summarized the entire situation. Everything had been taken care of, just not by the person everyone believed. The morning of the meeting arrived clear and cool. I dressed carefully and gathered the folders Emily and I had assembled over the previous weeks. Every email, every timeline, every supporting document. The evidence no longer lived inside isolated discoveries. It now formed a complete narrative. Before leaving the house, I paused beside the photograph of my father that sat on the bookshelf. For the first time since this began, I felt calm. Not because the situation was resolved, but because uncertainty had finally been replaced by facts. When I arrived at the attorney's office, several family members were already there. Linda stood near the conference room entrance greeting everyone with her usual warmth and confidence. She smiled when she saw me and walked over to offer a quick embrace. I returned the gesture politely. Then I noticed something she could not see. On the conference table inside the room sat several binders prepared by the attorney's staff. One of them contained copies of the emails. Another contained the communication records. As Linda continued smiling and speaking with relatives, I realized she still believed the story belonged to her. She had no idea that in a matter of minutes, The documents she spent months creating would begin telling a very different version of events. The conference room grew quiet as everyone found their seats. The attorney waited until the door closed before opening the first binder. Around the table sat relatives, advisors, and several professionals who had been involved in my father's affairs. Linda appeared completely at ease. She offered warm smiles, exchanged polite greetings, and settled into her chair with the confidence of someone who believed the difficult work was already finished. The attorney began by reviewing routine matters: asset summaries, property valuations, administrative updates. Nothing unusual. Then his tone shifted. He explained that concerns had been raised regarding certain communications used during the estate process. I noticed Linda straighten slightly. Not alarmed, merely attentive. The attorney opened a binder and distributed copies of several documents. One by one, he walked everyone through the timeline. Email records, approval messages, forwarding rules, communication logs. No accusations were made. No dramatic statements were offered. Only facts, dates, documents, verifiable records. As the presentation continued, the atmosphere in the room changed. Relatives who had arrived expecting a routine meeting now leaned forward in silence. Advisors exchanged careful glances. Questions that once seemed settled suddenly required answers. The attorney displayed a printed copy of the forwarding instructions connected to my email account. He explained how important correspondence had been redirected without my knowledge. Then he presented records showing messages sent in my name. The room remained silent. Linda's expression became more difficult to read. For the first time, her confidence seemed strained. The attorney continued methodically. Additional emails appeared. Messages describing me as uninformed. Messages suggesting I preferred not to participate in decisions. Messages portraying me as increasingly unable to manage important responsibilities. Every document carried a date. Every document fit neatly into the larger timeline. Nothing needed embellishment because the evidence spoke clearly on its own. Eventually, the attorney paused and turned toward me. "Mrs. Whitmore, would you like to add anything?" he asked. I looked around the room. For weeks I had imagined that moment. I expected anger. I expected satisfaction. Instead, I felt something quieter. Sadness. I stood slowly and placed one final folder on the table. Inside were additional records Emily and I had assembled. Communications concerning future planning discussions. Correspondence involving recommendations about my personal affairs. Documents suggesting decisions about my future had been considered without my knowledge. Several people reviewed the pages in silence. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. The truth required no defense. After a long pause, I finally spoke. I said that mistakes can be corrected. Financial matters can be reviewed. Administrative processes can be repaired. But trust is different. Trust depends on honesty, and honesty cannot survive when information is controlled, altered, or hidden. My voice remained calm. I never raised it. I never accused anyone directly. The documents had already done that work. When I finished speaking, the room remained quiet. Linda stared down at the papers in front of her. For once, there were no explanations waiting. No carefully prepared responses. No narrative left to manage. The story that had been built over months had collapsed beneath the weight of its own records. In the weeks that followed, the estate process was formally reviewed and corrected. Communications were re-examined. Decisions were revisited. More importantly, the truth became visible to everyone involved. Looking back now, I often think about my father and the lessons he tried to teach us. He believed integrity mattered even when nobody was watching. In the end, that belief proved stronger than any deception. The inheritance was eventually resolved fairly, but that was never the most important outcome. The most important outcome was discovering the truth before it became